Danny was a successful multimillionaire, but he never expected his wife was secretly seeing another man in a hotel. When he came to the hotel to check it out, Danny knew his wife was cheating on him. Danny didn't choose to expose the two men on the spot. Instead, he patiently returns home and waits for his wife, Laura, to return. Laura is unaware that her secret has been discovered by Danny. Danny pretended he didn't know her secret and stayed close to Laura. But when Laura turned round, Danny pulled out a gun and pointed it at him. Laura couldn't react fast enough and fell under Danny's gun. The sound of the gunshot attracts Alan's attention and he asks what happened. Danny fired several shots directly into the glass of the door. Disarming Alan's thoughts, he moved Laura's body near the front door, and Danny picked up the shell casings and wiped them clean. He burned the clothes on his body to wash away the smell of gunpowder. The police were called and arrived quickly and cordoned off Danny's house. They didn't know what had happened. They thought Danny's family had been kidnapped. They had to send in mediator Nick. The detectives went in to check out the situation and Danny didn't panic. When Detective Nick called to negotiate, Danny didn't move and opened the door to let them in. Nick, who was leading the team in, was spotted by Danny, who opened the door and let Nick in. But Nick looked at the gun in Danny's hand and realized it was bad because it was Danny he was negotiating with. Detective Nick didn't know what was going on, so he had to talk Danny into putting the gun down. Danny agreed to Nick's request, but only if he put down his gun too. Detective Nick complied, but as soon as Nick lowered his gun, Danny told Nick about the shooting of his wife. Nick also soon found Danny's wife lying on the ground. What shocked Nick even more was that Danny's wife, Laura, was his lover at the hotel. Because both had their own families, they didn't know each other's real identity. Seeing Laura collapsed in a pool of blood, Nick rushed to check Laura's injuries. Danny came to Nick's side with a gun and watched his lover Laura being killed by Danny. He grabbed Danny's gun when he wasn't looking. Enraged, Nick punched Danny in the face. The police heard the commotion and rushed in to subdue Danny. However, the police realized that Laura was not dead and quickly took her to hospital. Although Laura survived, she was shot in the head and is now a complete vegetable. The chances of Laura coming to her senses were slim to none. Danny, who was captured by the police, not only signed a confession. When Danny was confronted by the prosecutor with attempted murder charges, Danny fired his own lawyer to prevent him from defending himself, and Danny wanted to skip the hearing and go straight to trial, which surprised Danny's lawyer. Even Jack, the prosecuting attorney, was puzzled because, as a battle-hardened lawyer, Jack not only had the other side's autographed confession in his hand, he also had the gun that the police found at the scene, which had Danny's fingerprints on it. This case was a total win. He'd have Danny in jail in no time, and he wanted to see Danny's confidence. What he didn't realize was that the tables had turned. The police investigated the gun and found that Danny's gun was unused. Danny never left the house before the police arrived. In other words, the gun was still in Danny's house. The next day, Jack and his assistant led a team to search the scene, but they found no other guns at all, just for bullet casings and the gun that had never been used. No fingerprints were found on the casings, and the 4 bullets were missing. Jack's assistant realizes they've been duped, and it's clearly a setup by Danny. But Nick thought the gun had to be hidden somewhere, or Danny had destroyed it somehow. There had to be a clue. Without a murder weapon, it was hard to convict Danny. But Jack, always a winner, takes it upon himself to go and see Danny to try and find a break in Danny's case, to get the evidence out of him. But he didn't realize that Danny knew who he was before Jack even opened his mouth. Even how much Jack's credit card bills had cost, Danny knew exactly how much he had spent. At this point, Jack realized that Danny was not a simple person. He could only leave the place in disgrace. The first hearing of the attempted murder case will be held soon. Facing Jack, the prosecuting attorney, he made a statement on the case. Danny was too busy charting his work history to refute them. He realized there was little substance to the statements. Although no murder weapon was found, Jack found a witness in Detective Nick. Nick could testify that Danny was the killer in this case because Danny confessed to killing his wife Laura, and Danny immediately refuted it because he revealed that Detective Nick was dating his wife, and when he did, everyone was shocked. Jack the prosecutor couldn't believe it, and Detective Nick took a chance, but he didn't realize that Danny had discovered their secret. This time, the testimony left Detective Nick in the lurch. Nick didn't say a word to Danny's questioning. Jack realized something was wrong. Detective Nick realized that Danny's coming for Nick, and he looks at him with a smug look on his face. Nick was furious and tried to punch Danny, but he was quickly restrained by the police and thrown out, and the courtroom began to swing in Danny's favor because in the judge's opinion, if Nick and Laura's relationship was proven, Nick's testimony was biased and inadequate. He attacked Danny in court. Danny said he'd learned about Nick's affair with his wife Laura through a detective. Jack knew Danny had been plotting for a long time, and worse, because of it, the judge considers all possibilities. Under the poison fruit book principle, the judge suspects that Danny was coerced by Nick during the trial, which meant that Danny's signature was also inadmissible into evidence. The judge told prosecutor Jack to find new evidence. Otherwise, Danny would be acquitted at the next trial. This defeat gave Jack his first taste of frustration. But Jack, the victor, didn't give up. Jack continued to look for clues to the murder weapon, although they searched Danny's house again, but they couldn't figure out how Danny had hidden the gun. Without a clue to the murder weapon, Jack turned to Nick for a breakthrough. Detective Nick was put on hold because of the incident. Even Nick's family was hounded by the media. Nick was devastated. He was depressed all day, but Jack found out details of their meeting at the hotel. Jack went to the hotel to investigate. He found Danny on the security footage. That means Danny knew that Laura was having an affair with Detective Nick, which proves that Danny had a good motive. Unfortunately, Danny seemed to know what to expect. When he went to the hotel that day, he was wearing a hat, so Danny's face wasn't seen, which meant there was no new evidence against Danny. And with Jack's investigation, Danny seemed to have everything under control. This provocation aroused Jack's competitive spirit, and Jack came to wait for Laura. He was hoping Laura would come to her senses and testify against Danny herself, but the doctors told him it was all in vain. That's when Detective Nick approached Jack. Nick says he has a way to get Danny convicted, and that's by making the murder weapon. Nick told Jack he had connections in the evidence department. With Jack's permission, they make the murder weapon out of a gun, but Jack's heart was in the right place and he refused Nick's offer. Jack knows the consequences of falsifying evidence. As the trial approached, Jack was at a loss. He hadn't found any new evidence against Danny. If he lost the case, Jack would not only lose his reputation, but he would also see Danny go free. He had no choice but to consider Nick's offer, but Jack still can't produce the evidence of the fake murder weapon at trial.
I have no further evidence at this time, Your Honor.
Jack doesn't want to commit perjury by such underhanded means. With no new evidence, the judge dismissed the jury and Danny was acquitted. Danny won the attempted murder case, but it was Detective Nick who had the hardest time accepting it. To everyone's surprise, after the trial, Detective Nick committed suicide. Nick's death made Jack realize that he had to do something. He couldn't let Danny get away with it. Undaunted, Jack put his last hope in Danny's wife, Laura, but instead of coming to her senses, Laura waited for Danny's death blow because Danny was trying to kill Jack's last hope. As Laura's husband, Danny had the right to remove Laura's oxygen tube himself. Since Laura's chances of recovering from her vegetative state were slim, the hospital would agree to Danny's actions. Danny warned Jack to stay away from his wife. Danny may sue Jack for his surprise visit. Jack was upset. He wanted to save Laura's life. He desperately tried to get a restraining order from the judge, but by the time he got to the hospital, it was too late. Even with the court order, Jack was stopped by security for his previous behavior. Everything finally came to an abrupt end, and so did Laura's life. Jack's last hope was dashed, and the case seemed to be over. One day, Jack got a call from Danny. Danny said he was going on a trip and had something for him. But just then, the person who answered the phone was not Jack, but Jack's assistant, because the two were using the same mobile phone. The assistant got it wrong, which made Jack understand. Jack comes to Danny's house on his own accord, and Danny chooses to let Jack in. And Jack's sudden visit with the evidence of the gun also made Danny very puzzled. Jack finally understood. The murder weapon disappeared to the destination. Originally, from the time Danny went to the hotel, this perfect murder plan has already begun because the same mobile phone gave Jack a hint. Jack found that. Jack realized that Danny had used the same gun as Detective Nick, which meant that his suspicions had been correct. Danny came to the hotel to trade for Detective Nick's gun. Then, he used Detective Nick's gun to knock out Laura. And then when Nick came to negotiate, when Nick's attention shifted to Laura, Danny secretly switched the guns back. That's why Danny moved Laura to the door. Nick took the murder weapon without knowing it. It was this meticulous planning that made Danny fearless in court, but he couldn't have imagined that. Because of his pride, he wanted to keep playing games with Jet, but Jack found out the hard way. Although there can't be two trials, because Laura had her oxygen tube removed before she died, Jack charged Danny with first-degree murder. And since Laura was dead, Jack could get the bullet and Laura's brain for comparison. The police had been waiting outside for Danny for a while. When they came back to the courtroom, Danny wasn't as confident as he used to be, and he'd hired a team of professional lawyers. The film comes to a close at this point, although the director left the ending in suspense. I don't think it matters anymore. The court of justice may deviate once in a while, but justice will be served in the end.